Naughty dog.
Predator meets National Geographic. Oh yes, that's what we're talking about. We are talking CARNIFEX, and this one is directed by Sean Lahif. And yes, I would say this movie is comparable to the movie Predator meets National Geographic, and I'll explain why that is in just a moment. But what is the story? So this is an Australian movie, and it has a strong ecological message in it. Now the movie kind of takes place after kind of massive bushfires that happens quite, unfortunately quite regularly in Australia, and it devastates the ecosystems there. So the movie focuses on three individuals. Two of which are kind of biologists who are sent there into the kind of like these mangrove forests, I think they are, to try and document what wildlife has been there, to see if it's worth a kind of like that conserving the area. If there's endangered species there, I think they can't kind of like, it spoil the habitats and things like this. And they're accompanied by a filmmaker who kind of just wants a change of direction ultimately, and she kind of accompanies them to sort of document what they are doing. And while they're there, they may well have uncovered a long thought extinct species, this CARNIFEX, which is essentially, it was a real creature, and it's kind of related to marsupials. An early marsupial looks a little bit like a monstrous koala bear, crossed with kind of some type of big cat. So a pretty unique looking kind of, antagonist, so to speak, for this kind of creature feature. Certainly one you haven't seen lots of. And of course these are biologists who are there to conserve endangered species, but what do they do when they come up against one of these species that wants to eat them? And obviously there's your problem. So what will happen and what will they do? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let us discuss what I think works in CARNIFEX. Okay, so it is kind of like this isn't a traditionally filmed movie, I should point out. It's not found footage, it's not iPhone documentary or anything like that. But it does try and educate its audience. Yes, it has a narrative about a creature on the loose. But along the way, this movie presents a variety of different kind of factual kind of observations that the characters will make, kind of like try and teach the kind of this filmmaker, who's kind of our point of view character, things about the natural environment, things about particular kind of animal sounds, or facts about kind of the creatures that dwell within this kind of forest and things like this. So you'll probably go away from this movie learning something, at least one or two things maybe about the natural environment. And that's obviously quite important to the filmmakers, as I feel this is more what the movie wants to kind of talk about to a degree, and the way it's trying to get people to digest this information is to kind of put it in a horror film with a traditional kind of like monster on the loose type of narrative. But I did like the scientific effect and the kind of the scientific sort of way this kind of creature on the loose movie is put together, because they talk a lot about, what its kind of natural environment might be, its hunting patterns, and try and stick to, what a cryptid ultimately, or a kind of a long thought extinct creature might act and kind of be like in this kind of modern age. And I quite enjoyed that kind of scientific approach. It's also, quite an interesting kind of wrinkle where we have our victims, our people who are getting hunted ultimately, being people who are there to conserve animals. So you somewhat have a conflict of interest where, they obviously want to defend themselves, but at the same time you have to have this kind of like somewhat of a crisis of conscience, which I thought was an interesting kind of wrinkle to it. There's a smattering of other characters as well, but our main three is kind of the focal point. I have to say, I thought the acting was fairly strong here. I thought everyone did a good job of making kind of likeable and believable characters. The two kind of scientific characters I actually kind of believed. that in their roles, they seemed to kind of like, you know, come across that they were educated and kind of knew what they were sort of talking about, and their sort of interactions. Like the guy's a little bit nerdy, he's clearly got a little bit of a crush on like the kind of the female one, and you know, things like that. I thought was, but it's not overstated. It's not like, doesn't kind of take up lots of kind of you know, running time. It's just kind of things that are there that I think give the acting some believability, but also the characters as well, the way they're written. Again, I would say kind of somewhat kind of realistic sort of characters, make them believable and likeable. So it obviously is all kind of set within this kind of this forestry area, and obviously set in Australia, so we have some very impressive kind of location shooting here that kind of shows off the natural environment. And if you're a fan of, you know, documentaries about the wildlife, you know, the Green Planet, National Geographic, like I've kind of mentioned, there's a lot of kind of like kind of incidental kind of footage and B-roll, establishing shots that will show you and really show off this kind of like this kind of landscape and things. Maybe a little bit too much, we'll come on to it, but you know, it's certainly very a beautiful film in a lot of ways, and kind of like obviously the contrast and colours, the greens, and you know, this kind of the greens and browns in this kind of environment do look very, very stunning, I have to say. And again, the creature is an interesting choice because it's, you know, there's certainly more monstrous creatures that you could have picked as a kind of a creature on the loose kind of style movie, but I've got to say, I think that and it kind of acts a little bit like the Predator in a way. You know, it's kind of up there using the trees. We even have a little bit of kind of thermal vision, not by the creature obviously, so it definitely has some kind of Predator comparison in some respects. But I like the idea that it's something we haven't seen much of. It's one that's based in kind of science. It's one that's based on a, you know, an extinct creature, things like that. But it's not one you've seen loads of. So I quite enjoyed it. So what doesn't work in this movie? Okay, so the biggest problem, and I actually watched this with someone else. A lot of the time when I do reviews, I watch films on my own. Here I actually watched this with someone else, and they thought it was incredibly slow. You know, and I've got to concur. This movie's kind of intention, I think, is more to kind of like spotlight the environment and the creatures than to tell an exciting narrative. The narrative is okay, but it's nothing you haven't seen before, and boy does it take a long time to get there. So this kind of creature feature, you won't really see much of in the way of the creature really until the final act. I mean, we get, you know, glimpses here and there, and we get like a kind of, like I say, a couple of other characters that are purely introduced to be killed off. But it's a little bit of a slow movie in some areas, and you know, it's nice looking, and it does offer you some educational material, which I think is benefit. But for a narrative, it's a little bit of a slow start to what is, let's be honest with you, a very, very simple story. So there is that. Now, as much as I kind of liked the characters here, and I thought they were well written in their personal interactions, there comes a point in the movie where I have to say I thought the characters seemed to get dumb, unfortunately, especially the male character out of our three characters, which in itself is kind of a little bit annoying because that always seems to be what happens in modern films now. But yes, our characters get a little bit dumb and deliberately, well, not deliberately, but they kind of foolishly make more trouble for themselves than you would think someone with a scientific background would maybe think about. So that was a little bit kind of irritating. The creature itself, I liked the idea of the creature. I like seeing something that we haven't really seen all that much of. But, you know, it's CGI rendered, and I don't think the CGI is particularly strong, unfortunately. Now, the interesting thing for me was you don't see loads of this thing. You know, you don't really get loads of good looks at it. So the CGI is relatively sparse because we don't see a hell of a lot of it, to be honest with you. So it's surprising when we do see it that it's actually on the weaker side. It's not the worst CGI I've ever seen, but it clearly is CGI. I mean, they do a good job in making kind of like prosthetic like wounds and things, but there's a couple of sequences where you will see part of the animal, and I think, you know, this surely would have better to have like a claw, like a practical effect. I mean, and I understand you might not want to make a whole like puppet of this thing, but nonetheless, it's kind of you know, make an arm or something, or make, you know, its head or something. It just seems to be that they've relied on CGI a little bit too much for me in this one. And, you know, although I like the idea that, again, that it's a kind of a real creature, it isn't the most terrifying creature you've ever seen. Let's just call a spade a spade. That's more of a... I'm not going to necessarily critique the movie too much for that, but, you know, because it's trying to have its kind of feet in a scientific basis. It doesn't want to go into dinosaurs and stuff, I get that. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like... It looks like a vicious koala that's obviously a lot bigger. It's not the most kind of terrifying thing to look at. The way it acts and kind of hunts, you know, that's done fairly well in regards to making it seem you don't know where it's going to be. But I don't know, visually, it's not the most scary thing, to be honest. But again, I understand they want to stick to the science on that one, so that's maybe I'll just mention it. It kind of ends somewhat abruptly. You know, I don't want to go into spoilers here, and I've kind of hinted at it already, but the movie's characters, you know, how they're depicted, there's some things there that kind of irritated me about certain type of trends that we're seeing lots of these days. So what I'm going to say, I don't want to spoil it because it's going to give too much away otherwise. Overall, I still quite enjoyed the movie. It's not particularly gripping. I think it's a well-made film. And it has that ecological message, and I do feel you'll probably learn a little bit about certainly the Australian wildlife in this movie. And I'll give it an above average mark, but it's not exactly a thrilling movie. It's an okay kind of creature feature with a somewhat humdrum plot. You know, but it's a passable film. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.